Hey everyone, welcome back to Breakthrough Innovation, where we uncover what it really takes to lead change, create value, and build what's next. I'm JL Heather, one of the founders of Centered, where we lead organizations through navigating complexity, sparking creativity, and unlocking the full potential of their teams through innovation coaching and strategy. Now, most executives will tell you that innovation is a top three strategic priority. And in the same breath, most of those same executives will tell you that their innovation pipeline just isn't delivering the results they expected. The problem is never a shortage of ideas, it's a shortage of discipline around what gets funded, what gets killed, and how resources move across a portfolio of bets that span from incremental improvements to long term growth plays. Noel Sobelman has spent more than 25 years helping leadership teams at companies like Medtronic, Honeywell, and Siemens close exactly that gap. He's the author of Innovation Portfolio Management, linking strategy to execution, and he's built a reputation for helping organizations stop treating innovation like a collection of disconnected projects and start treating it like a managed system. Today, we're going to unpack where innovation actually breaks down inside large organizations and what companies that get it right are doing differently. Again, this is Breakthrough Innovation. Let's dive right in. Noel, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Jay. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So you've worked at a few large organizations here, probably more than a few, like Medtronic, Siemens, Honeywell. Like I mentioned before, I actually used to work at Honeywell. But these are companies that don't lack for any sort of like investment or ambition. So I'm wondering when you walk into these larger organizations and you have a leadership team that's telling you, hey, our innovation isn't delivering, where do you typically find the breakdown? Like what are the signs you look for?
Yeah, there's some metrics that we can turn to, and we do a lot of the company I work with does a lot of benchmarking. So it's good to get everybody on the same page with regard to where the issues are. And one way to do that is just to look at performance. The numbers don't lie. If you look at things like return on R&D investment, or schedule slip, or schedule predictability, or how much we're wasting on projects that don't make it to market or that fail, or worse, if they fail once they get in the market, it's pretty easy. It makes it a lot easier to make the case for where the gaps are.
Mm.
And schedule predictability is a big one. Time to market is a big one that keeps coming up in terms of, how do we stay out front in this world that's changing so quickly, and how do we make sure that we're delivering, we're meeting our customer needs, and we're delivering that with a pipeline of products and a where we have predictable delivery. We can continuously serve our customers with new or enhanced products in our product line, or offerings or services. It doesn't have to be product related.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. You were talking just about kind of that idea of like time to market, return on investment. I think a lot of times what I see in organizations is they sit at one end of a spectrum where either nothing can really get approved because the hurdles are legion. There's too many places where a no can kill it, and you need too many yeses to approve it. And then I see the other end of the spectrum where all the organization will kind of brag about, look, we've got like 30 different innovation, projects going on right now, and they're all kind of funded at, barely life sustaining levels. I'm curious, how often do you see people at the ends of that spectrum, and who do you see, or I don't know, you don't have to name a company if you don't want to, but like, what do you see in the middle?
Yeah. So I most often see companies that don't say no enough. So they
Right.
don't have a process or a discipline where they are drilling a lot of holes, looking at a lot of different opportunities and
Right.
quickly narrowing. That's where the term funnel, innovation funnel, comes in. Sometimes we have to look at lots of opportunities, but the key is to quickly narrow that funnel and have agreement on what's the criteria we're going to use to say no. So to make sure that we are not just loading up our resources, our engineers or scientists to capacity, but
Right.
the metric really is throughput. What is the right
Mm.
demand relative to supply of resources that demand of projects relative to supply of resources? Getting that mix right is important, because at the end of the day, it's about throughput, not how much we say yes to.
Right.
So the companies that get this, you're doing that in a world that's changing very quickly. So the biggest mistake I see is that companies, they have their annual operating plan process or their long range planning process at the beginning of the year. They set the plan and then they execute throughout the year. Well, these days the world's changing too quickly. Not all projects are on time. There's lots of issues come up. So you need to revisit that strategy. You need to revisit your project priorities and make some tough decisions along the way. And that's kind of the central theme behind the book, and that you have to manage a portfolio of projects and always be pruning the low value projects so you can divert those scarce resources to higher priority, higher value projects. And you're doing that continuously throughout the year, at least course correcting throughout the year and making some strategic decisions and maybe pivoting on some projects. So it's about maximizing the value of the overall portfolio, and getting that right is a real key to growing and hitting your growth goals.
Yeah. Yeah, I know you talk a lot about portfolio management. I am curious though. I think what I see a lot is teams are very eager to say, this is what success looks like. This is how we know our idea would be successful. Whether or not they test that effectively is a different story, but they tend to have a good idea of, what are our targets? Like, what would success look like? What I don't see a lot, and maybe you see something different, is teams that would say, here's how we know it's time to stop. Here's how,
Yeah.
rather than waiting for the executive team to tell us no, we can actually self-select and say, you know what, we've actually tested this enough now that we know that the risk isn't worth the reward, the market isn't there. How do you help organizations empower their teams to stop rather than waiting for an executive?
Yeah, JL, you mentioned the key word is test, and not just internally. It's getting out of the building and
With
testing with
customers.
customers, right?
Yeah,
So, where is the uncertainty, or identifying what needs to be true for this project to be successful? And you're always making some assumptions on what, especially when you're looking at more in the breakthrough end of the spectrum of
right,
uncertainty. So it's about getting out of the building and finding out, is this something the customers will pay for? Is this something that is technically feasible? Is this something that is going to be a scalable business? Is it viable? So there's a number of hypotheses that you're making throughout the development of a project. So it's about very quickly, especially early on, de-risking by getting out of the building, running tests with customers, not just asking them, would you buy this, but actually running a call to action experiment where they actually
right,
have to provide some value to prove that, yes, we have some factual evidence. Taking that back to the governance board or whatever you call your funding committee and saying, now we have evidence and we have higher confidence. Give me another tranche of funding to continue this project.
right.
So that's the other key, is that metered funding approach, where we don't want to say yes and invest ahead of learning. So it's about rapid, and then every 12 weeks or so going back in front of the funding board and saying, we thought this was true, but certain things weren't. Certain things we verified are true, and here's what we're recommending we do for the next. And we want another tranche of funding to go out and run more experiments. So it's that iterative approach where the solution evolves and you're learning along the way. And that's the best approach I've seen to advancing the real separating the winners from the losers. And if something is not, if if you get that customer evidence that your assumption was not true, or the business case is not viable, then that's when you need to start recommending our resources are better used on something else.
Well, and it's interesting, like you're describing what I think most organizations would call a stage gate process, which I'm not arguing against that at all. But I wonder how many organizations actually get that right. And what is it do you see people miss when they're setting up the stage gate process? Because I think I don't see many organizations do that well.
Well, there's there's stage gate for your core business where it's more predictable and you can have
Yeah,
criteria. When we get to this gate, we should know these things. We should have our business plan should be fully validated. We should have to know what we're doing in the next phase. So it's very predictable, and you make a decision based on an ROI or a spreadsheet.
yeah,
Then there's the kind of development where there's high uncertainty, and it's
right,
it's less of a gated development process. It's more about investment readiness levels. When do we have enough evidence that we can invest another tranche of funds to continue testing?
right,
So it really depends on where you are on that uncertainty spectrum. If you're closer to the core business, when there's more known across not just the technology, but the desirability and the feasibility of the technology, if you're closer in and it's just a product line extension, then it's a more cut and dry process, and you have
Right.
gates where executives can look at the portfolio and they can look at, are we still on track and is the project still viable as a business? It's when you get into that uncertainty area, when you're creating a new to the world or a new business model, that you have to change that process and it becomes more agile. It becomes more about
Right.
what are the learning metrics. So there's two different sets of metrics, two different types ways of governing those projects, and even different kinds of makes up of the project teams, different processes depending on where you are on that uncertainty spectrum.
Yeah. No, and I like that comparison to agile because I think the distance between stage gates where uncertainty is high needs to be shorter, at least from what I've seen, versus predictable, they can be a little bit longer. What I'm curious about is how do you help leadership quantify the uncertainties? So, like, because you mentioned portfolio management to give a little bit of context. How do you compare the uncertainty on project A to the uncertainty on project B and make a decision with limited resources, which one moves forward?
Yeah, that's an important question. And the metric that I always return to is evidence strength.
Hmm.
So you can imagine if you're asking a customer to give you their email, that's easy. That's a low bar. If you're asking them to give you their social security number, that's a higher bar. So you're running experiments, and you're designing and running experiments, and as you get higher and higher fidelity prototypes, higher and higher fidelity, that you've heard the term MVPs or representations of the product, you're getting investing more, you're growing your team, but along the way you're getting that evidence that warrants further investment. And that evidence, the strength of the evidence is what you're looking for. How many, if we ran a campaign where we put out a brochure and asked people to dial a number to call us back if they're interested in this product, is 70% of the people that got the brochure going to call us? What is that threshold to
Yeah.
where we have the confidence that, yeah, we're onto something here? So
Right.
however you design that experiment, there's a whole science behind experimentation design, but we could go down and talk more about that. But designing and running experiments where that's that call to action and you get some kind of value exchange to prove that the customer really does see that this is a promising, or they
Yeah.
they they validated that assumption that we're making, then we can move on to the next riskiest assumption and continue to
Right.
test it.
No, and I like that idea of strength of evidence. Uh, and I've seen that work well. I think maybe the next question I have is I'm just kind of thinking through some of our engagements and the things we've done. And this probably comes up more in terms of manufacturing than maybe like software development, things like that. But in industries where the time from idea to the launching of a product or whatever can be relatively long. Let's say like launching a car, creating a new year model of a car is typically a multi-year design kind of moment. In situations like that, whether it's cars or whatever, if you do so say you're going down this stage gate process with short stage gates where evidence is driving the way and you find something that has that high potential, how do you help those organizations that maybe are slower to turn at the rudder still take advantage of that faster innovation process without necessarily endangering their more stable processes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's separating the stable, predictable from the kind that we're talking about that's more on the breakthrough end of the spectrum. So
Yeah,
there's I call it, you want enough separation to where, because they're really different processes. One's more
right,
agile, one's more predictable. So for the ones that are more transformative, new to the world, it's about velocity of learning. Are we learning
right,
quickly? Are we testing the riskiest, highest impact assumptions where we don't know things in order to progress the project forward? At a certain stage, you get to the point where it's more of an execution. Okay, now we've de-risked it. Let's turn the crank
right,
and create it to market. The team's bigger. We're more in execution mode. So
right,
knowing where you are on that development timeline is an important part of the governance process. But it does require a different mindset, because when you're asking for funding from the decision maker, those decision makers need to help you surface what are the big assumptions we need
right,
to have confidence that we continue to invest in this idea. So I've learned from a lot of failures in my career where we took worked for a company in the late 90s where we tried to develop an MP3 player before this is pre iPod. Yeah, we didn't find out that the product was a miss, didn't make it in the market until we actually developed it. So we spent the alternative of what I'm describing is you spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and then you find out that the customer didn't want your idea.
Yeah.
That's the thing you're trying to avoid. You're trying to move
Right.
up
Yeah.
some of that risk, test it with low cost experiments, and de-risk it before you spend a lot of money on engineering or scientists to develop. So in those product lines, like do a lot of work in pharmaceuticals where it can be a 10-year development period
Right.
or longer, or like you say in the auto industry, um, they're about quickly de-risking, making sure building your confidence through experimentation, and it's about the velocity of learning. So getting
Right.
in that agile approach where you're build, test, learn, and getting that de-risk down to where you can then turn on the execution engine and deliver the solution to the
Well, I think maybe a slight pivot on that question. I think in those more regulated long-term industries, pharma, automotive, sometimes it's the leadership behavior that's causing the issue. Like, you have someone who's in the pharma space who's like, "It takes this amount of time to get FDA approval. It takes this amount of time to get the data ready for that." It takes they kinda work backwards. They become very risk averse. How do you help them see their mindset, their behavior is the thing that's actually causing their innovation pipeline to stall? And what do you feel like the hardest behavior to change is?
Yeah, and automotive is another example. There's long
Yeah.
lead, your tooling cycles are
Right.
long lead. But in terms of the leadership behaviors, really one thing is right sizing the pipeline so you're being realistic. You might want to plan your capacity to a buffer. Instead of loading up to 115% of our capacity, maybe we load up to 80%. We have a 20% buffer because we know things are not going to go perfectly smoothly.
Right.
So that gives us some flexibility. Maybe there's some outsourcing options. Maybe there's some if we have the visibility into where our constraints are downstream, we can stagger projects. So there are techniques you can use to improve that throughput of products, which translates into quicker time to market. But in terms of executive decision making, it takes saying no to some things, and that's tough.
Yeah.
That's tough to do because our tendency is to load the teams up to capacity, and that's not always the right answer. And the other thing
Mm.
I'd suggest is once in a while go through and clean out your pipeline. There's always those pet projects. There's the
The
zombie
zombie
project,
project.
right? Where why are we doing this? This project has been languishing. There's a lot of it's maybe there's sunk cost or emotional sunk cost tied to a
Right.
project. Let's clean out those dogs, the ones that are never going to really move the needle, and that frees up capacity to work on some of the things that are higher value, and accelerate those through the pipeline. So that's where project management gets into managing a portfolio, and that visibility word that I used, having the visibility downstream into where the constraints are is so key because without it, you're being reactive, and that causes churn
Yeah.
in the pipeline. When you hit a bottleneck, and it's not always your engineering or your science, it could be quality, it could be regulatory affairs, one
Right.
of those support functions where the resources on projects are spread very thin. But if there's only one person that can do it and they're supporting six different projects, everything's going to suffer. So
Right.
having the visibility there, and that gives you some options to be proactive about resolving constraints and setting the teams up for success by staffing them appropriately to execute.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I know we're right at time. So maybe last question, and we can keep this one short. I've talked to a number of chief innovation officers. I feel like that role has kind of been growing pretty fast over the last like 5, 10 years. And so many of them are feeling this pressure to show results very, very quickly. So if you're talking to a chief innovation officer, and they're like 90 days, I got to show the value of this. I got to show that we can deliver real results. What do you coach them on to do first?
Yeah, that's a tough one because if we're in the breakthrough innovation space, transformative innovation, I would look for the leading indicators that you're making progress because if you wait until you're talking about projects that might take 5+ years to show any kind of revenue. So showing once you're in the market and you're getting revenue, it's easy there's certain
Right.
metrics you can look at for adoption to show any kind of trends. But while you're working to get there, it's back to those learning metrics. How much have we de-risked this project, this opportunity? So have we validated that there's a true customer problem that needs to be solved? Have we validated that the solution matches that is going to solve that problem with
Yeah.
evidence? And is that evidence strength growing as we get closer to scaling the product, even before we launch it? Have we proven that customers will pay a certain amount for this,
Right.
so that the business case is viable? So showing those kinds of metrics, which are more leading indicators, is a good way to, it's a progress. Now the
Yeah.
CFO might argue, well, I don't care about all that. I just want to see
They're
the
not real
ROI.
numbers.
So
Yeah.
that's where the mindset change needs to happen. And you can show the alternative. You can show them a fancy spreadsheet with a nice hockey stick, and what's the head of Intuit used to say, I've had lots of failures where initially the spreadsheet looked awesome. That was his
Right.
quote, right? So, um, the alternative is, we can make up some numbers and guess at what the ROI is going to be, but
Right.
changing that mindset, instead of showing me some made up numbers that are complete hallucinations, show them that we're making progress, and the
Right.
customer is telling us they want this, and here's the evidence to show that. That's the substitute for ROI.
The yes and I would give to that is, and this is something I talked to a number of chief innovation officers about, it is how do you feed your learnings back into the main business as well? Because that's
Yeah.
another great way to show the value of what you're learning without necessarily delivering a new product or service is by using that learning to help enhance what you're already doing as well. So that's the only yes and I would have there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you need that existing business, because you can't
Yeah.
the advantage corporates have over startups is that they have the infrastructure to really scale
Right.
a new business, a promising new business. They have the brand, they have the customers, they have the channels, they have a lot of things that startups don't have, and they should be taking advantage of that. So
Right.
while I talked earlier about setting up this separation from the core business when you're in the transformative space, there still needs to be an island to the mainland. There still needs
Right.
to be that you're leveraging the assets that give you an advantage as a corporate. So you can create those new sources of growth, and you take advantage of the fact that you have the resources and the assets to really scale the thing once you
Right.
get to market.
Awesome. Well, Noel, I really appreciate the time. You're obviously an expert in your field. If anyone's looking to work with you, connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Just reach out on LinkedIn. That's the best way. I'm in the middle of promoting a new book that's coming out in September, Innovation Portfolio Management, where I talk a lot about these concepts. So you can learn more about that there. I'm doing lots of giveaways. So I'm giving away the first chapter if you want to get a taste for what the book's all about. And then as we get closer to launch, I'll be doing lots of workshops for companies. But LinkedIn is the best way to start.
Awesome. Well, Noel, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. For everyone else that made it all the way to the end with us, I'd love to hear from you all in the comments. What are some of the innovation challenges you're seeing? What's stopping that breakthrough innovation from happening at your organization? And if you know anyone who's struggling, pass this episode along to them, introduce them to Noel, and share the wealth. Lastly, while you're down there leaving that 5-star review, don't hesitate to reach out to Noel directly through LinkedIn and connect and help him grow his network. So, Noel, thank you again. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you, JL. Appreciate it.